I think it's still breathing." Ethan Parker's voice came out shaky as he crouched beside the rusted chain-link fence, gripping the metal with white-knuckled hands. He had been walking home from school, cutting through the overgrown path behind the old fairgrounds like he always did, when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was just the wind pushing through the trees, but then he caught something else. A low, pitiful whimper that made his heart skip a beat. He had to push through a tangle of thorny bushes, his backpack catching on the branches as he moved forward. And then he saw it. A golden retriever, its fur dirty and matted, its back leg twisted awkwardly in the fence. The poor thing looked like it had been stuck for hours, maybe even longer, its tired eyes barely opening as Ethan knelt beside it. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his hands shaking as he reached out. "It's okay. I got you." The dog whimpered again, its chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Ethan swallowed hard, looking over the fence to see if anyone else was around. The fairgrounds had been abandoned for years, the old rides long since dismantled, the concession stands boarded up. He was alone. His fingers moved carefully along the dog's fur, trying to assess how badly it was hurt. The leg was definitely caught, the metal wires wrapped around it tightly. There was dried blood, but not too much. Maybe it wasn't broken. Maybe he could free it. "You're okay," he said, more to himself than the dog. "I just gotta—" He stopped short when the dog whined loudly. He needed help. Digging his phone from his pocket, he quickly called his mother. "Mom, I found a dog stuck in a fence. I think it's hurt." "What? Where are you?" "Behind the fairgrounds." He glanced down at the dog again. "Can you call Dr. Reeves?" Dr. Laura Reeves was the town veterinarian. Everyone in Maplewood knew her, and she had treated Ethan's old cat more times than he could count before Toby had passed away. If anyone could help, it was her. "I'll call her now," his mom said. "I'm on my way too. Just be careful, honey." Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see him, and ended the call. He turned back to the dog, speaking softly to keep it calm. "Help's coming, okay? Just hold on." It felt like forever before he heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. A minute later, Dr. Reeves's truck pulled up along the side road, and the woman climbed out, her short blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail. She had a warm but no-nonsense way about her, and Ethan let out a relieved breath as she hurried over with her vet bag. His mother arrived right after her, rushing over with worry written all over her face. "Oh, sweetheart, are you okay?" Ethan nodded. "I'm fine, but the dog—" Dr. Reeves was already kneeling down, carefully assessing the retriever's leg. "It's not broken," she announced after a moment, "but it's definitely swollen. Poor thing's exhausted." She reached into her bag, pulling out a pair of thick gloves before carefully working the wires free. The dog whimpered but didn't fight her, and within a few minutes, it was loose. The retriever didn't try to stand, just lay there panting heavily. "Let's get him to the clinic," Dr. Reeves said. "He needs fluids and I want to check for any infections." Ethan looked at his mom, hopefully. "Can I go with them?" His mother hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, but we'll have to talk about what happens next." Ethan didn't care about next. Right now, all he cared about was making sure this dog was okay. With Dr. Reeves's help, they carefully lifted the retriever into a blanket and carried it to the back of the vet's truck. Ethan sat beside it the whole ride to the clinic, one hand resting gently on its side, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of its chest. By the time they arrived, the dog's eyes had closed completely, its body limp with exhaustion. Ethan followed Dr. Reeves inside, watching anxiously as she worked. She gave the retriever fluids, cleaned its wounds, and wrapped its leg with careful hands. "It's a boy," she told Ethan as she worked. "No collar, no chip. He's underweight, but nothing a few good meals won't fix." Ethan chewed his lip. "What's going to happen to him?" Dr. Reeves sighed, giving him a small, knowing smile. "Well, we'll have to see if anyone claims him first. But if no one does, we'll find him a good home." Ethan's heart pounded. He knew what she meant. He had wanted a dog for as long as he could remember, but his parents had always said no. Too much responsibility, too much work. But now, looking at the retriever resting on the vet table, Ethan knew this wasn't just any dog. This was fate. He just had to convince his parents of the same thing. As the retriever slept peacefully, Ethan sat beside him, his fingers brushing gently over the soft, golden fur. "I think I'll call you Lucky," he whispered. "Because no matter what happens, I think we were meant to find each other." Lucky didn't open his eyes, but his tail gave the smallest, faintest wag. And for Ethan, that was enough. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. His first thought was Lucky, and before he even changed out of his pajamas, he was begging his mom to take him back to the clinic. "You haven't even eaten breakfast," she said, raising an eyebrow as she flipped pancakes on the stove. "I'll eat fast," Ethan promised. "I just want to check on him." His mother sighed, but didn't argue. "Fine, but after you eat." Ethan inhaled his pancakes, barely tasting them, and was in the car with his mom 15 minutes later. The ride to the clinic felt longer than it had the night before, even though it was only a 10-minute drive. When they arrived, Ethan practically ran inside, his heart pounding. Dr. Reeves looked up from the front desk and smiled. "Morning, Ethan. I was just about to check on your friend." Ethan followed her to the back room, where Lucky was curled up on a soft blanket inside a kennel. The retriever's fur was still dirty, and his body looked thin beneath the fluff, but his eyes opened when Ethan stepped closer. "Hey, buddy," Ethan whispered, crouching down. Lucky lifted his head, his tail thumping weakly against the blanket. Ethan smiled, reaching his hand through the bars so Lucky could sniff his fingers. The dog licked him once before resting his head back down. "He's responding well," Dr. Reeves said, leaning against the counter. "His leg is swollen but healing. He's got some bruising and dehydration, but with some food and rest, he'll be all right." Ethan's mom folded her arms. "Has anyone come looking for him?" Dr. Reeves shook her head. "No chip, no tags, no calls." Ethan swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" "Well," Dr. Reeves said carefully, "if no one claims him, he'll need a home." Ethan looked up at his mom hopefully. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We'll talk about it," she said. That was better than a no. For the next few days, Ethan visited Lucky every afternoon. He brought old tennis balls and treats he bought with his allowance, feeding them to Lucky through the kennel bars. Each day, the dog seemed a little stronger, his tail wagging a little faster. By the end of the week, Dr. Reeves let Ethan take him outside on a leash for short walks around the clinic. Lucky limped at first, but refused to be carried. He had a quiet determination that made Ethan love him even more. Dr. Reeves watched them from the porch, her arms crossed. "He trusts you," she said. "That's not something to take lightly." Ethan nodded. "I won't." His mom still hadn't given him a firm answer, but she hadn't said no either. Ethan tried not to push too hard, afraid of ruining his chances. Then, on Friday night, everything changed. Ethan was eating dinner with his parents when the doorbell rang. His father went to answer it, and a few moments later, his voice carried into the dining room. "Ethan, someone's here for you." Ethan hurried to the door, his stomach twisting. A man stood on the porch, his expression unreadable. He was middle-aged, dressed in jeans and a work jacket. There was something about him that made Ethan uneasy. "You the kid who found the dog?" the man asked. Ethan nodded slowly. The man pulled out his phone, holding up a picture. "That's my dog." Ethan's heart dropped. It was Lucky. Same golden fur, same dark eyes. But something was off. Lucky looked thinner in the picture, his fur rougher. The man's voice was flat when he spoke again. "I lost him a couple weeks ago. I'd like him back." Ethan's mom stepped up beside him, her expression cautious. "Sir, do you have any proof that he's yours?" The man's jaw tightened. "I don't need proof, I'm telling you, he's mine." Ethan's heart pounded. Something wasn't right. Lucky had been found without a collar or tags, starving and hurt. If he belonged to this man, why hadn't he looked for him sooner? "I'd like to speak to Dr. Reeves," Ethan's mom said. "She's the one who's been taking care of him." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Fine." They drove back to the clinic, the man following in his truck. When they arrived, Dr. Reeves listened carefully as he repeated his claim. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "Lucky was found in bad shape. If he's yours, I'd like to see some veterinary records, proof of ownership." The man scowled. "I don't have that." Dr. Reeves didn't back down. "Then I can't release him to you." His hands clenched into fists. "You think I'd hurt my own dog?" Dr. Reeves met his glare steadily. "I think if you cared about him, he wouldn't have been starving and trapped in a fence." The man's face turned red, but he said nothing. After a tense moment, he turned on his heel and stormed out. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Dr. Reeves sighed. "That was close," Ethan swallowed. "So what now?" So, Ethan turned and ran home as fast as he could, Lucky right beside him. When he burst through the front door, his parents immediately noticed his panicked expression. "What happened?" his mom asked. Ethan barely caught his breath before explaining. His dad's face went hard. "That's it. I'm calling the police." That night, Ethan slept with Lucky curled up on his bed, the dog's warm body pressed against his legs. He knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting Lucky go without a fight. Ethan spent the next few days constantly looking over his shoulder, the fear of the man's threat lingering in his mind. He knew his parents were just as worried. His dad had spoken with the police, and while they took the report seriously, they couldn't do much since the man hadn't broken any laws yet. They advised the family to stay cautious and report any further incidents immediately. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He kept Lucky close at all times, making sure he was never outside alone. At night, he double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, listening for any unusual sounds outside. Lucky must have sensed his unease because he rarely left Ethan's side, his eyes always alert whenever they went for walks. One afternoon, Ethan sat on the back porch, scratching Lucky behind the ears. His mom joined him, handing him a glass of lemonade. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. "Still thinking about that man?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he said he'd be back." His mom's face darkened. "We won't let anything happen to Lucky. Your dad and I are making sure of that." Ethan took a sip of his drink, trying to push away the worry. "I just don't understand. If he really cared about Lucky, why did he let him get so sick and hurt?" His mom shook her head. "Some people don't take care of what they have until it's gone. But that doesn't mean they deserve to get it back." Ethan ran a hand over Lucky's fur, feeling a little more determined. Then I won't let him take him. That night, something woke Ethan from his sleep. At first, he wasn't sure what it was. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. Lucky, who had been sleeping beside him, lifted his head and let out a low growl. Ethan froze. A sound came from outside. It was faint, but it was there, the crunch of gravel under slow-moving footsteps. His heart pounded as he reached for his phone. He quietly climbed out of bed, creeping toward the window. Peering through a crack in the curtain, he felt his stomach drop. The black truck was parked down the street. Ethan's fingers shook as he dialed his dad's number, not wanting to make any noise. He held the phone to his ear, barely breathing. "Dad," he whispered when the call connected. "He's outside." Within seconds, Ethan heard movement from his parents' room. His dad appeared in the doorway, already dressed. He held a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. "Stay here," his dad ordered. "Lock the door behind me." Ethan swallowed hard, but nodded. As soon as his dad stepped out, he locked the door and sat on the floor beside Lucky, gripping his collar. The next few minutes were agonizing. He heard the front door open, his dad stepping onto the porch. Then the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. A voice rang out. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. There was a brief pause, then the sound of retreating footsteps. Tires squealed as the truck peeled away. A minute later, his dad reappeared, locking the door behind him. He looked furious but relieved. "He was standing across the street just watching," his dad said. "Didn't say a word, just ran when I shined the light on him." Ethan's mom had woken up by now, her face pale. "We need to do something. This isn't just about a dog anymore." His dad nodded. "I'm calling the police again, and I think we need to consider getting some security cameras." Ethan felt a cold chill run through him. It wasn't just about Lucky anymore. It was about their whole family. The next day, a police officer visited their house, taking down all the details. They promised to patrol the neighborhood more often, but Ethan could tell his parents weren't satisfied. That evening, his dad installed 2 security cameras, one above the garage and another by the backyard. They also decided that Lucky would sleep in Ethan's room every night, just to be safe. The next few days passed in a strange mix of tension and normalcy. Ethan went to school, did his homework, and took Lucky for walks, but there was always that underlying worry that the man would return. Lucky seemed to sense it too, staying closer than ever and always looking around whenever they were outside. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Dr. Reeves looked down at Lucky, who had pressed himself against Ethan's legs. "I think it's time we find him a real home." Ethan's mom sighed, rubbing her temple. "We'll talk about it." Ethan turned to her, eyes pleading. "Please, Mom." She looked at Lucky, at the way he leaned into Ethan's touch, and let out a slow breath. "All right," she said finally. "We'll give it a try." Ethan's face broke into a wide grin. "Really?" His dad chuckled. "You'd better be ready for early morning walks." Ethan dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Lucky. "Welcome home, buddy." Lucky wagged his tail, pressing his nose into Ethan's shoulder. For the first time since he'd found him, the dog looked completely at peace. Ethan barely slept that night, too excited by the thought of bringing Lucky home. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined all the things they would do together. Long walks at the park, playing fetch in the backyard, curling up on the couch after school. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When he rushed downstairs, his mom was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. His dad was flipping through the newspaper, and Lucky, his dog, was lying at their feet. "Morning," his mom said with a knowing smile. Ethan immediately knelt beside Lucky, rubbing behind his ears. "Hey, buddy. How'd you sleep?" Lucky wagged his tail, his body still thin but already looking a little better after a few days of regular meals. His mom sighed, setting down her mug. "Okay, here's the deal. Lucky stays, but we're setting some ground rules. You're responsible for feeding him, walking him, and making sure he's taken care of. This is a big commitment, Ethan." "I know," Ethan said quickly. "I'll take care of him, I promise." His dad folded the newspaper, giving Ethan a serious look. "And if his owner comes back with proof, we do the right thing." Ethan swallowed hard, but nodded. "Yeah, I get it." His mom exchanged a glance with his dad before exhaling. "All right, then it's official. Welcome home, Lucky." Lucky's ears perked up at his name, and Ethan laughed as the dog nudged his face with a wet nose. The rest of the day was a blur of excitement. Ethan took Lucky to the pet store with his mom, picking out a sturdy leash, a soft bed, a food bowl, and a chew toy shaped like a bone. Lucky sniffed everything curiously, tail wagging. The cashier smiled as she rang them up. "New pup?" she asked. Ethan nodded proudly. "Yeah, he's the best." When they got home, Ethan set up Lucky's bed in the corner of his room. But by bedtime, the dog refused to stay there, instead curling up right beside Ethan's bed. "That's okay," Ethan whispered, stroking Lucky's back. "You can stay right here." The following week was the happiest Ethan had felt in a long time. He and Lucky quickly fell into a routine: morning walks before school, afternoon playtime in the backyard, and quiet evenings where Lucky would lay beside him while he did his homework. One afternoon, as they were playing fetch, Ethan noticed something strange. Lucky hesitated before running after the ball, his ears twitching like he had heard something. Then, instead of retrieving it, he turned his head toward the street. "What is it, boy?" Lucky's tail wagged, but there was an alertness in his eyes. Ethan followed his gaze and saw a black truck parked a few houses down. It looked vaguely familiar, and his stomach twisted as he remembered where he had seen it before. The man from before. Ethan's grip tightened on Lucky's leash. Was he watching them? Had he been driving around looking for the dog? He swallowed hard and turned back toward the house. "Come on, Lucky. Let's go inside." The next morning, Ethan told his mom what he had seen. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she immediately called Dr. Reeves. "I don't like this," his mom said after she hung up. "If he's just driving around looking, that's one thing. But if he starts coming by again, we need to be careful." Ethan's dad agreed. "We'll keep an eye out. If he tries anything, we'll call the police." Ethan hugged Lucky tightly. "I won't let anyone take you." A few days passed without any sign of the truck, and Ethan started to relax again. But then, one afternoon, as he was walking Lucky, something happened that made his heart pound. They had just reached the corner of their street when a voice called out, "Hey, kid." Ethan turned, his stomach twisting. The man was standing outside his truck, watching them. "I know that's my dog." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Lucky isn't yours." The man scoffed. "I raised him since he was a pup." "Then why'd you let him starve?" Ethan shot back before he could stop himself. His hands gripped Lucky's leash tightly, ready to run. The man's face darkened. "You don't know anything about it." Ethan took a step back, pulling Lucky with him. "He's not yours anymore." The man didn't move. His gaze flicked to Lucky. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low. "That dog belongs to me." Ethan was walking home from school when he saw a woman standing near the fairgrounds, the same spot where he had first found Lucky. She looked to be in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a hesitant stance. When she spotted Ethan, she straightened up. "Excuse me," she called. "Do you have a golden retriever?" Ethan stopped, his heart pounding. "Why?" The woman hesitated. "Because I think I know where he came from." Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He stepped closer, gripping his backpack strap. "Who are you?" "My name's Rachel," she said. "I used to live with the man who's been bothering you." Ethan's breath caught. "What do you mean?" She sighed, glancing around like she wasn't sure she should be talking. "I left him months ago. He wasn't a good person, and he didn't treat his dog well either. When I heard he was looking for the dog again, I started asking around. Someone told me about you." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why does he want Lucky back?" Rachel shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe just because he doesn't want to lose?" She looked at Ethan, her expression softening. "But if Lucky's happy with you, you should keep him." Ethan blinked, trying to process everything. "He is happy with me." Rachel nodded. "Then don't let him go." Ethan felt a newfound determination settle over him. He wasn't going to let Lucky go, not to someone who had hurt him, not to someone who didn't deserve him. Rachel handed him a small piece of paper. "This is my number. If things get worse, call me. I'll tell the police what I know." Ethan took the paper, gripping it tightly. "Thank you." She gave him a small, sad smile before walking away. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching her go, then turned toward home. Lucky was his now, and he was going to do whatever it took to keep him safe. Ethan walked home with his thoughts racing. Rachel's words had stirred something deep inside him: fear, anger, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was family now. And Ethan was going to do everything in his power to protect him. As he stepped onto the porch, Lucky greeted him with an enthusiastic wag of his tail, as if he sensed Ethan had just done something important. Ethan knelt, rubbing the retriever's soft fur. "Don't worry, boy. I won't let him take you." Inside, Ethan found his parents sitting at the kitchen table, deep in discussion. They looked up when he entered, their expressions immediately shifting to concern. "How was school?" his mom asked. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before taking a deep breath. "I met someone today. Her name is Rachel. She used to live with that guy, the one who's been following us." His dad's face hardened. "What did she say?" Ethan relayed everything Rachel had told him, watching as his parents exchanged worried glances. When he finished, his mom reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police again. If she's willing to talk to them, they need to hear what she knows." His dad nodded. "And we need to be extra cautious. No walking Lucky alone, no answering the door unless it's someone we know." Ethan tightened his jaw. "I understand." The next day, the police came to the house again. They took Rachel's information and assured the family that they would increase patrols in the neighborhood. Ethan felt a little safer, but the tension still hung in the air. Days passed without incident. Ethan began to hope that maybe the man had finally given up. But that hope was shattered one evening when Ethan and his dad took Lucky for a walk. They were halfway down the block when Lucky suddenly froze, his ears perked up. His body tensed, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Ethan followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. The black truck was parked at the end of the street. His dad saw it too. He grabbed Ethan's shoulder and turned him around. "We're going home, now." Ethan didn't argue. His heart pounded as they quickened their pace, Lucky trotting beside them. The truck didn't move, but Ethan felt eyes on them the whole way back. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every little noise outside made his heart race. Lucky seemed just as restless, lifting his head every time the house creaked. The next morning, Ethan's mom made an announcement over breakfast. "We're installing a fence." Ethan looked up, startled. "A fence?" His dad nodded. "We talked about it last night. It'll give us some extra security, and it'll give Lucky a safe space to run around." For the next few days, workers arrived to put up a sturdy wooden fence around their backyard. Ethan felt a little better knowing that Lucky would be safe inside their yard. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was still coming. One afternoon, just as the fence was being completed, Ethan heard a knock at the door. His mom opened it cautiously, revealing a familiar face. Rachel. "I have something you need to see," she said, her voice urgent. Ethan and his parents let her inside, and she pulled out a small envelope. "I found these in my old things," she said, handing it to them. "Photos of him and Lucky, but look at them closely." Ethan's dad spread the pictures on the table. At first, they just looked like normal photos of a man and his dog. But as Ethan looked closer, he saw something that made his stomach turn. Lucky looked miserable. His ribs were visible, his fur unkempt. In one picture, he was chained to a post, his head lowered. In another, the man was holding his collar tightly, his face twisted in anger. Ethan's mom covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Rachel nodded. "I thought you needed to see it for yourselves. He never deserved that dog." Ethan clenched his fists. "Then we're never letting him take Lucky back." That night, Ethan went to bed feeling more determined than ever. He knew that man wouldn't give up easily, but neither would he. The following afternoon, Ethan took Lucky into their newly fenced backyard. The dog seemed to sense the newfound safety, running around happily before flopping onto the grass with his tongue hanging out. Ethan laughed, sitting beside him. "You like it, don't you?" Lucky gave him a playful bark in response. The peaceful moment didn't last long. A sudden noise made Ethan look up. He turned toward the fence, his breath catching in his throat. A shadow moved on the other side. Someone was there. Ethan stood slowly, pulling Lucky close. His mind raced. Was it just a neighbor? Or was it him? Then, a voice spoke from the other side, low, cold, and unmistakable. "You think a fence will stop me?" Ethan's blood ran cold. He didn't see a face, but he knew exactly who it was. Lucky let out a deep growl, pressing against Ethan protectively. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned and ran inside, locking the door behind him. His parents looked up in alarm as he gasped out what had just happened. His dad grabbed the phone. "That's it. We're pressing charges." Ethan's mom was already checking the security cameras. "I got him on video," she said. "He was right by the fence." The police arrived within minutes. Ethan watched as officers reviewed the footage, their expressions grim. "This is enough to take action," one officer said. "We'll find him." Ethan clenched his fists. He wasn't going to live in fear anymore. Neither was Lucky. As the police drove off into the night, Ethan knelt beside his dog, running a hand through his golden fur. "We're not letting him win," he whispered. Lucky licked his face in response, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt something other than fear. He felt ready to fight back. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling restless. Even though the police had promised to take action, he couldn't shake the fear that the man would come back. The security footage was solid proof of trespassing, but what if that wasn't enough? What if he tried something worse? Ethan climbed out of bed and found Lucky already awake, lying near the door as if keeping watch. The golden retriever lifted his head as Ethan approached, his warm brown eyes full of trust. "Morning, buddy," Ethan whispered, kneeling to ruffle Lucky's fur. "We're gonna figure this out." Downstairs, his parents were already up. His dad was on the phone, speaking in hushed but firm tones, while his mom stood near the window, watching the front yard. The tension in the house was almost suffocating. His mom turned when she saw him. "How are you feeling?" Ethan shrugged. "Okay, I guess. Did the police call back?" His dad hung up the phone and nodded. "Yeah, they found him last night and brought him in for questioning." But what?" Ethan's stomach twisted at his dad's hesitation. His dad sighed. "They couldn't hold him. He denied everything, and since he technically didn't commit a crime besides trespassing, they had to let him go with a warning." Ethan clenched his fists. "So he's still out there?" His mom reached for his hand. "We're not letting our guard down. The police said they'll keep an eye on him, but we need to be careful. We're looking into extra security measures, too." Ethan nodded, but frustration bubbled inside him. Lucky had been through enough. He didn't deserve to live in fear. None of them did. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to take Lucky for a short walk around the neighborhood. His mom insisted on coming along, not wanting him to go alone. He didn't argue. The encounter at the fence was still too fresh in his mind. As they walked, Lucky seemed alert but calm, his tail wagging as he sniffed the air. Ethan found some comfort in that. If Lucky wasn't panicking, maybe things weren't as bad as they felt. They turned a corner, and Ethan spotted Rachel sitting on a bench outside a small coffee shop. When she saw them, she waved them over. "Any news?" she asked, glancing between Ethan and his mom. Ethan nodded. "The police picked him up last night, but they let him go." Rachel sighed. "I was afraid of that. He's good at slipping through the cracks." His mom frowned. "You knew him well, didn't you?" Rachel hesitated before nodding. "Too well. He's always been like this, controlling, manipulative. I stayed longer than I should have, thinking he'd change, but he never did." Ethan looked at her, trying to understand the weight in her voice. "Do you think he'll give up?" Rachel was silent for a moment. Then she shook her head. "Not easily." His mom tightened her grip on the leash. "Then we need to be ready for anything." They talked a little longer before parting ways. As they walked home, Ethan felt a little less alone in the fight. Rachel understood. She had been through it too, and she was willing to help. That night, Ethan lay awake, listening for any sound outside. Lucky slept at the foot of his bed, his breathing slow and steady. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. But then, at exactly midnight, Lucky shot up, his ears perked and his body tense. A second later, Ethan heard it too. A noise outside. His heart pounded as he slid out of bed and crept to the window. Peeking through the curtains, he saw a dark figure near the fence. Even in the dim light, he knew who it was. The man. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and called his dad's number. Within seconds, his dad was up, followed by his mom. Lucky stood at the door, growling lowly. His dad peered out the window, his face hardening. "Stay inside," he ordered, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the door. Ethan's mom reached for the phone. "I'm calling the police." As his dad stepped outside, Ethan's stomach churned. He wanted to do something, but all he could do was wait. A moment later, his dad's voice rang out. "What the hell are you doing here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his hands raised slightly. "Just checking in on my dog." "He's not your dog," Ethan's dad snapped. "Get off my property." The man smirked. "You can't keep him forever." Ethan felt sick. He knew the man was baiting them, trying to get a reaction, but his dad didn't budge. "I won't tell you again," his dad said, his grip tightening on the bat. Just then, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The man's smirk disappeared. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the night just as the police car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, immediately taking statements from Ethan's dad and mom. Ethan watched from the window, Lucky still growling softly beside him. "We're increasing patrols," one officer assured them. "If he comes back again, call us immediately. We'll push for a restraining order." Ethan's dad nodded, his jaw tight. "That's not enough. He's not going to stop." "We understand," the officer said. "But for now, let's take it one step at a time." Ethan hated that answer. One step at a time felt too slow, too risky. But what choice did they have? The officers left after taking more details, and the house finally settled into silence again. Ethan sat on the couch, his mind racing. His mom sat beside him, running a hand through his hair. "We'll get through this, sweetheart." Ethan nodded, but didn't speak. He just reached down and hugged Lucky tightly. The dog rested his head on Ethan's shoulder, as if sensing he needed reassurance. Ethan didn't know what the man would do next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up Lucky without a fight. Ethan barely got any sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man standing near their fence. That smug expression on his face, as if he knew he still had the upper hand. Lucky lay curled up at the foot of his bed, his breathing steady, but Ethan could tell he wasn't entirely at ease either. The golden retriever's ears twitched at every small noise, his body still on high alert even in sleep. The next morning, Ethan's mom sat him down at the kitchen table, a worried expression on her face. His dad was already on the phone with the police again, pressing them to do more, but Ethan knew their options were limited. Until the man did something that crossed the legal line, he would keep getting away with these threats. "We're not letting this go, sweetheart," his mom reassured him, placing a hand over his. "But I need you to promise me something. If you ever see him again, you don't confront him. You don't engage. You just come straight home or call for help, okay?" Ethan nodded, but deep down he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Every part of him burned with frustration. He had done everything right. He had saved Lucky, given him a safe home, and yet this man still felt entitled to him. It wasn't fair. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked into town with Lucky, his mom close by. She didn't say it outright, but he knew she was making sure he wasn't alone, just in case. He didn't argue. He was still on edge, and having her nearby made him feel a little safer. They stopped at the pet supply store, where Ethan picked up more food and treats for Lucky. The cashier, an older woman named Mrs. Lawson, smiled as she rang up their items. "He's looking better every time I see him," she said, giving Lucky a quick scratch behind the ears. "You're taking good care of him." Ethan smiled, but it faded quickly as he glanced toward the front window. A truck drove by slowly, not the black truck, but Ethan's nerves spiked anyway. Every unfamiliar vehicle made his stomach twist. His mom noticed. "Let's head home, okay?" Ethan nodded, and they left, keeping Lucky close by. When they reached their street, his dad was already outside talking to someone Ethan didn't recognize. The man was tall, wearing a uniform with a security company logo on his jacket. "What's going on?" Ethan asked as they approached. His dad turned to him. "We're hiring a private security firm to do extra patrols around the house. They'll make rounds at night and keep an eye out for anything suspicious." Ethan felt a small wave of relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but at least it was something. That night, Ethan went to bed feeling slightly safer. He listened as Lucky settled down beside him, his presence comforting. But just as Ethan was about to drift off, Lucky's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, listening. At first he heard nothing. Then, A faint noise outside. A rustling near the fence. Ethan's heart pounded. He didn't want to wake his parents yet, not if it was just an animal. Slowly, he slid out of bed and crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. And there he was. The man stood just beyond the fence, partially hidden by the shadows. His posture was relaxed. Too relaxed, like he was taunting them. Ethan clenched his fists. Lucky let out another growl, louder this time. The man looked up, locking eyes with Ethan through the window. Then, he did something that made Ethan's blood run cold. He smiled. Ethan backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed his phone and rushed to his parents' room, shaking his dad's shoulder. "He's outside," he whispered harshly. His dad was up in an instant. He grabbed his phone, calling the security company and the police at the same time. Within minutes, security lights flashed on outside as the patrol car pulled up. Ethan watched from the window as 2 guards searched the perimeter. "He's gone," one of them reported after a while. "But he was definitely here." Ethan's dad was livid. "This has to stop. He's escalating." The police arrived shortly after, but once again, there wasn't much they could do. No property damage, no forced entry. Just another warning. "We'll keep pressing for a restraining order," one of the officers assured them. "In the meantime, keep your security measures in place. He's getting desperate." Ethan hated those words. Desperate people did reckless things. The next day, Rachel called. "I heard what happened," she said. "I think it's time I do more than just warn you." Ethan's dad put her on speakerphone. "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated before speaking. "I still have some of his old things, records, paperwork. He has a history of animal neglect. If I can get this information to the right people, we might be able to stop him from trying to claim Lucky legally." Ethan's mom let out a slow breath. "Would you be willing to make a statement?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." It was the first real ray of hope Ethan had felt in days. The next few days were tense, but knowing Rachel was helping made Ethan feel a little more in control. She handed over every bit of evidence she had, and their lawyer promised to push for action. It was slow-moving, but it was progress. Then, one evening, Ethan and his dad were in the backyard with Lucky when headlights appeared at the end of their driveway. A police car. 2 officers stepped out, looking serious. One of them spoke first. "We have news. We received a court order granting a restraining order against the man harassing you." Ethan's mom, who had just stepped outside, covered her mouth in relief. His dad let out a long exhale. "Finally." Ethan felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't over completely, but it was a huge step. The man couldn't come near them now without facing real consequences. The officers continued. "We've also flagged his record. If he tries to claim ownership of the dog in any legal capacity, it won't hold up." Ethan knelt down beside Lucky, wrapping his arms around the dog. "You're safe, buddy." Lucky wagged his tail, pressing his nose into Ethan's shoulder. Ethan's dad shook hands with the officers. "Thank you." As the police left, Ethan looked up at the sky. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they had a real chance at peace. Lucky was staying right where he belonged. Ethan barely had time to process the news before his dad started going over new rules. The restraining order was a big step forward, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The man had ignored warnings before. Who was to say he wouldn't do it again? That night, Ethan sat on his bed with Lucky beside him, scratching the dog's ears absent-mindedly. "It's almost over, buddy," he whispered. "You're staying right here, no matter what." Lucky wagged his tail lazily, resting his head on Ethan's lap. The sense of relief, that had settled over the house was real, but it wasn't complete. Ethan could still feel the tension, the nagging voice in his head warning him that it wasn't truly over. Not yet. The following day, his parents made good on their promise to increase security. A second set of cameras was installed, this time covering every blind spot around the house. His dad met with the private security team, making sure they would continue their patrols for at least another month. His mom spoke to the neighbors, letting them know to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Ethan found himself growing restless. Every part of him wanted to believe that the restraining order would keep the man away. But deep down, he knew better. Someone like that didn't just give up. 3 nights later, his fears were proven right. It was just past midnight when Lucky bolted upright, his ears twitching. Ethan, still half asleep, groggily reached out to pet him. "Go back to sleep, boy." Lucky didn't move. Then, Ethan heard it, a soft, deliberate creak outside the window. His stomach twisted. He moved as quietly as possible, slipping out of bed and creeping toward the blinds. Peeking out, he felt his breath catch in his throat. There, just beyond the fence, was the man. Unlike last time, he wasn't lingering in the shadows. He was standing in the open, hands in his pockets, looking straight at the house, looking straight at Ethan's window. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He called his dad first, whispering urgently, "He's outside." Within seconds, Ethan heard his dad moving downstairs. The security lights flashed on, flooding the yard with brightness. But the man didn't run. Instead, he smirked. Ethan's dad threw open the back door, stepping onto the porch with a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other. "Get off my property, now!" The man took a step forward. "That dog belongs to me." "No, he doesn't," his dad snapped. "You come near this house again, you're going to jail." The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "We'll see about that." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. The police arrived soon after, but like before, there was little they could do. He hadn't broken into the house. He hadn't physically threatened anyone. He was towing the line of the law, and he knew it. Ethan barely slept that night, every noise making his pulse spike. He knew this wasn't over. The next morning, his mom called Rachel. When she arrived, Ethan could tell she wasn't surprised by what had happened. "He's pushing boundaries," she said. "He's seeing how far he can go before someone stops him." Ethan's dad clenched his jaw. "Then we have to stop him before it gets worse." Rachel nodded. "I have an idea. It's risky, but it might be the only way to end this." She pulled out a file folder and placed it on the table. "These are documents proving his history of neglect. I also have contacts who can help us push for an emergency hearing. If we can get enough evidence together, we might be able to have him declared unfit to own an animal." Ethan's mom looked at the documents. "How fast can we do this? If we act now, a few days?" Ethan swallowed hard. "And if he fights back?" Rachel's expression hardened. "Then we fight harder." The next few days were a blur. Ethan's parents met with lawyers, filed documents, and pushed for a hearing as quickly as possible. Rachel provided sworn statements, and even some of the neighbors stepped forward to vouch for Ethan's family, confirming that the man had been harassing them. It wasn't just about Lucky anymore. It was about stopping him for good. The night before the hearing, Ethan found himself unable to sleep again. Lucky lay beside him, breathing softly. Ethan stared at the ceiling, anxiety churning in his stomach. What if the judge ruled against them? What if the man convinced them that he deserved Lucky back? He reached down and ran a hand over Lucky's fur. "I won't let them take you," he whispered, no matter what. The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy air of tension. Ethan sat beside his parents in the courtroom, his hands clenched together tightly. Across the room, the man sat with his own lawyer, looking as smug as ever. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Rachel testified first, detailing everything she had witnessed over the years. The neglect, the way he treated Lucky, the way he had ignored responsibility time and time again. The evidence was overwhelming, but the man's lawyer fought back, insisting that Lucky had been temporarily lost, and that he had every right to reclaim him. Then Ethan was called to the stand. His throat went dry as he stood up, walking to the front of the room. The judge gave him a kind nod. "Tell us, in your own words, why you believe Lucky should stay with you." Ethan took a shaky breath. "When I found Lucky, he was starving. He was hurt. He had no collar, no chip, nothing to say he belonged to anyone. I didn't know where he came from, but I knew he needed help." He turned to look at the man, feeling anger rise in his chest. "If he really cared about Lucky, why did he let him suffer? Why didn't he look for him sooner? Why did Lucky flinch every time he heard his voice?" Silence filled the room. The man's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Ethan faced the judge again. "Lucky is happy now. He's safe. And I won't let anyone take that away from him." The judge studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke. "I've reviewed all the evidence, and I find no reason to return the dog to its previous owner. Effective immediately, ownership is granted to the Parker family." Relief crashed over Ethan like a wave. His parents hugged him, and even Rachel smiled. The man stood abruptly, his face twisted in fury. "This isn't over." But it was. Security escorted him out, and as Ethan stepped outside with Lucky by his side, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. Lucky was finally safe. For real this time. Ethan could still feel the rush of relief as they left the courthouse, Lucky trotting beside him, his tail wagging as if he knew he had finally found his forever home. But even as Ethan stepped into the safety of their car, a lingering unease settled in his chest. The man's final words echoed in his head. "This isn't over." His dad must have sensed his worry because as soon as they were driving home, he glanced at Ethan through the rearview mirror. "Don't let what he said get to you. He can't do anything now." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. People like that didn't just walk away quietly. The first few days after the court ruling were peaceful. It almost felt like life was returning to normal. Ethan went back to school, Lucky settled into his routines at home, and his parents finally started to relax. The private security company still patrolled the neighborhood, but even they reported no signs of the man returning. Then, late one evening, Ethan's mom received a phone call that changed everything. She was standing by the kitchen sink when her phone rang. Ethan watched as she answered, expecting it to be his dad calling on his way home from work. But as soon as she spoke, her expression darkened. "No, I'm sorry, that's not possible," she said, her voice tense. "The court has ruled. He has no legal claim." Ethan sat up straight. He didn't need to hear the other end of the conversation to know exactly who it was. His mom gripped the phone tightly. "If you contact this number again, we'll report you for harassment." She hung up and took a shaky breath. It was him. Ethan clenched his fists. What did he want? He's trying to appeal the case. He claims new evidence, but it's all nonsense. He just won't let it go. His dad arrived home shortly after and listened carefully as his mom explained the situation. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "We'll call our lawyer in the morning and see if he can actually go through with this appeal. I doubt the court will even entertain it." But the next morning, Ethan's worst fear came true. Their lawyer called with an update. "He's filed a motion," he told them. "I don't think it has much standing, but he's using every loophole he can to keep this going." Ethan couldn't believe it. "But we already won!" "I know," the lawyer said, his voice calm. "But we'll fight this. Just sit tight, and I'll keep you updated." Ethan could feel the exhaustion settling in. He had thought they were past this. He had thought Lucky was finally safe. The following days were a whirlwind of legal discussions and updates from their lawyer. Ethan felt trapped in a cycle, waiting for another court date, waiting for more news, waiting for the man to finally disappear from their lives. Then, one night, something happened that shook Ethan to his core. It was just past midnight when Lucky suddenly jumped up from his bed, his ears perked and his body rigid. A second later, Ethan heard it too. A scraping noise outside. Ethan's breath caught. He scrambled out of bed and moved toward the window, peering through the blinds. His stomach dropped. The man was outside their house. Not by the fence, not by the street. Right outside the back door. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't even think. He just grabbed his phone and bolted down the hall to his parents' room, Lucky at his heels. His dad was already awake by the time Ethan burst in. "What is it?" Ethan barely managed to get the words out. "He's outside." His dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and called the police while Ethan's mom rushed to check the security cameras. A moment later, her face went pale. "He's trying to break in." Ethan's dad didn't wait. He marched toward the front door, stopping only to grab the bat they had kept near the entryway ever since this whole ordeal began. The sound of sirens filled the air moments later, blue and red lights flashing through the windows. Ethan rushed to the front room just in time to see officers storming into the yard. The man was caught completely off guard. He turned to run, but the police were faster. Within seconds, they had him pinned to the ground. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he watched the scene unfold. He couldn't believe it. After all this time, all the threats and intimidation, he was finally caught. One of the officers knocked on the door a few minutes later. Ethan's dad answered, and the officer gave him a firm nod. "He's in custody now. We're charging him with attempted burglary and violating the restraining order." Ethan exhaled, his knees feeling weak. His mom spoke up, her voice shaky. "Does this mean he's finally out of our lives?" The officer hesitated, but nodded. "This should be enough to put him behind bars for a while. You won't have to worry about him anytime soon." Ethan felt Lucky press against his side, as if sensing his relief. He knelt down and hugged the golden retriever tightly. For the first time in weeks, Ethan let himself believe that it was finally over. Lucky was truly safe now. Ethan barely slept that night. Even though the police had finally taken the man into custody, his mind kept replaying everything that had happened. The sight of him at the back door, the sound of Lucky's low growl, the flashing lights of the police cars. It was all burned into his memory. The house was quieter than usual the next morning. His parents were up early, drinking coffee in the kitchen, their voices low as they discussed the events of the previous night. When Ethan walked in, they both looked up, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. "How are you feeling?" his mom asked, setting down her mug. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. It still doesn't feel real." His dad leaned forward, hands clasped together. "The police assured us he's being held without bail. He won't be able to bother us for a long time." Ethan nodded, but there was a small part of him that couldn't fully relax. He'd believed they were safe before, and yet the man had kept coming back. Lucky padded over to him and nudged his hand with his nose. Ethan smiled faintly and scratched behind his ears. "At least you're okay," he murmured. His mom gave him a gentle smile. "We all are." The rest of the morning passed quietly. His dad made a few calls to their lawyer to make sure the case against the man would hold up in court, while his mom reached out to Rachel to keep her updated. Ethan tried to distract himself with schoolwork, but his mind kept wandering. Around noon, the doorbell rang. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat before he reminded himself that the man was in custody. His dad stood and went to the door, peering through the peephole before opening it. It was Officer Grant, the officer who had been handling their case since the beginning. "Good afternoon, Mr. Parker," Officer Grant greeted. His gaze flickered to Ethan and his mom as they joined his dad at the door. "I just wanted to come by and give you an update in person." Ethan's dad stepped aside, letting him in. "Is something wrong?" "No," the officer assured them. "In fact, I have good news. We've been going through his records more thoroughly, and it turns out there were outstanding charges against him in another state. With last night's attempted break-in and his repeated harassment, the DA is confident they can prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law." Ethan felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying begin to lift. "So he won't just get out in a few months?" Officer Grant shook his head. "Not this time. He's looking at serious time behind bars." His mom exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. "Thank you for letting us know." The officer nodded. "You all have been through a lot. I know it's going to take time to feel normal again, but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to make sure he never bothers you again." Ethan's dad shook his hand. "We appreciate it." After Officer Grant left, Ethan finally let himself take a deep breath. This time, it felt different. This time, it felt real. That afternoon, Ethan took Lucky for a walk around the neighborhood for the first time in what felt like forever. The golden retriever trotted happily beside him, sniffing the grass and wagging his tail as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan wished he could feel that carefree, but the past few weeks had changed him. He glanced around, taking in every parked car, every passerby, every movement in the distance. The paranoia wasn't going to fade overnight. But as he watched Lucky roll around in the grass, Ethan realized something important. They had made it through. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on the back porch with Lucky curled up beside him. His parents were inside, still discussing legal matters, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't listening in with fear. He knew they were handling it. Rachel called a little while later. His mom answered, but after a moment she handed the phone to Ethan. "Hey," Rachel's voice came through the line. "How are you holding up?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Better, I think. It still doesn't feel real." "That's normal," Rachel said gently. "You went through something really scary. It's okay if it takes time to feel safe again." Ethan looked down at Lucky, who was dozing peacefully beside him. "I just don't get it. Why did he want Lucky so badly? It was never really about the dog, was it?" Rachel sighed. "No, it wasn't. Some people just want control. It doesn't matter what over." Ethan nodded slowly. "Well, he lost." Rachel chuckled softly. "Yeah, he did." After they hung up, Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. Then he reached down and gently stroked Lucky's fur. "You're home, buddy," he whispered. Lucky's tail thumped against the porch, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan finally let himself relax. Even if there were still challenges ahead, one thing was certain. Lucky wasn't going anywhere. Ethan woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no immediate anxiety twisting in his stomach. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that had been missing for weeks. He stretched and turned to see Lucky sprawled out on the floor beside his bed, his golden fur catching the morning light. The dog's tail thumped lazily against the floor, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning, buddy," Ethan whispered, reaching down to scratch behind Lucky's ears. Lucky let out a content sigh, then rolled over onto his back, demanding belly rubs. Ethan chuckled and obliged, grateful for the moment of normalcy. As he got dressed, he could hear his parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were light, lacking the stress and worry that had become too familiar. When he walked downstairs, his mom was flipping pancakes, while his dad read through the morning paper with a relaxed expression Ethan hadn't seen in a while. "You're up early," his dad remarked, setting the paper down. Ethan shrugged. "Guess I just slept better." His mom smiled as she set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "That's a good sign." They ate breakfast together, something they hadn't done in weeks without the weight of constant fear hanging over them. His mom talked about going to the farmer's market later that day, and his dad mentioned taking Lucky to the park. It all felt so normal. Later that morning, Ethan clipped Lucky's leash onto his collar and stepped outside. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the scent of fresh grass. Lucky wagged his tail, eager to stretch his legs. They walked through the neighborhood, passing familiar houses and waving neighbors. Everyone seemed to know about what had happened, but no one brought it up. They just smiled and gave him nods of support. And that was enough. When they reached the park, Ethan let Lucky off his leash, watching as he bolted across the field, ears flopping as he ran. It was a sight Ethan would never get tired of. He found a bench and sat down, watching as Lucky chased a butterfly, barking happily. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. Rachel had texted him earlier. "Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you need anything." Ethan smiled and typed back, "Thanks, we're good. Lucky's at the park right now." Happier than ever. A moment later, she responded, "That's great to hear. You both deserve it." Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket and leaned back on the bench. The warmth of the sun on his skin, the sight of Lucky enjoying himself, it all made him feel lighter than he had in a long time. After an hour, he called Lucky back over, and they headed home. His mom had left a note on the counter saying she was out at the market, and his dad was in the garage fixing something. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet. Ethan lay on the couch, and Lucky curled up beside him, resting his head on Ethan's lap. He absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur, his mind finally at ease. The past few weeks had been terrifying, but they had made it through. The man who had tormented them was gone, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. Their home was safe, their lives were returning to normal, and Lucky was exactly where he belonged. Ethan let out a deep breath and smiled. They were finally free. Over the next few days, life slowly began to settle into a routine again. The nightmares that had plagued Ethan began to fade, and he no longer jumped at every little sound outside. His parents also seemed more at ease, allowing themselves to enjoy the quiet moments that had once felt like a distant memory. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Lucky, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His dad joined him, 2 steaming mugs of cocoa in hand. He handed one to Ethan and took a sip of his own before speaking. "You did good, kid." Ethan looked up, surprised. With what? His dad smiled. With everything. You stayed strong, you fought for what was right, and you didn't back down. That's something to be proud of. Ethan looked down at Lucky, who had curled up at his feet. He thought back to that first day, when he had found Lucky trapped in the fence, helpless and afraid. Now the dog was full of life, safe and happy. I just did what anyone would do. His dad chuckled. Not everyone would have fought as hard as you did. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, taking a sip of his cocoa. The warmth spread through him, comforting and familiar. A few days later, Rachel stopped by. She brought a small gift for Lucky, a new chew toy in the shape of a bone. Lucky took it eagerly, prancing around the living room as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Rachel laughed. He really is living his best life now. Ethan grinned. Yeah, he is. Rachel sat down on the couch beside him. And how about you? How are you feeling? Ethan considered the question for a moment. Better. It still feels weird not having to constantly look over my shoulder, but I think I'm finally starting to relax. Rachel nodded. That's good. You deserve to feel safe. Ethan glanced at Lucky, who had settled onto the floor, chewing happily on his new toy. Yeah, we all do. As Rachel left, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The worst was behind them. It wouldn't be forgotten, but it no longer had power over them. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, Lucky curled up beside him. He thought about the future. There was still so much ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. Tomorrow was a new day, and they would face it together.